Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. Greenlight.com/Wondery.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, Natalie Wood gave her heart to James Dean, but she married Robert Wagner. 40 years after her suspicious death, the question remains, was it an accident or was she murdered? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my movie star co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. That was a very nice descriptor. It's definitely not about me, because there's a reason that we have great faces for podcast.
That's true. You know, the YouTube channel barely gets any traction. There's a reason for it.
There's a reason for that. We are not YouTubers, and you know, like the patrons, what they get are faces made for radio. So
it's true. We make no effort for them at all.
But I
barely put on a shirt. I was like,
I barely put on a shirt. Let's be honest. But who doesn't love the classic movie stars? I mean, even though it was not of my era, I grew up watching Shirley Temple and Natalie Wood, Fred Astaire, all of them. And there's this mystery and aura among like old Hollywood. But unfortunately, with the case we're talking about today, there was a tragic end to a just seemingly fascinating life.
Well, you know, Alice, as we record this, we're getting ready for Halloween. But as you listen to it, it's going to be December. So you guys are moving into the Christmas season. And you may have already watched Miracle on 34th Street. Natalie Wood, who is the subject of our discussion today. If you've ever seen that movie, the old one, the classic one, not the remake, the little girl in that movie is Natalie Wood. It wasn't her first movie, but it was definitely the one that sort of thrust her into the limelight and made her, in many ways, America's sweetheart. And she would follow that up with a ton of hits, movies that all of you have seen. Rebel Without a Cause, West Side Story, Gypsy,
Brainstorm, yep. Meteor. I mean, this was back, I don't know if it was like right or wrong, but when movie studios would sign, like you would get signed onto a studio and it'd be like, you're making 12 films this year. You know?
Yeah. It was a little rough on the actors.
It was rough on the
actors
and actresses, but it was amazing because when you found your starlet, then man, it would just like nonstop. You just print, money off of them because of their incredible allure to the audiences. And she did. She connected with people.
She really did. And in a way that she became one of those Titanic names in pop culture. But I got to tell you, in a lot of ways, her career has been overshadowed by her death, a death that remains mysterious to this day. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the mystery around it. 1 or 2 episodes. I'm not sure exactly how long this one's going to take. There's a lot here. This is, what happened to her is there are so many different competing stories that it's difficult to know exactly what happened. And we thought we knew for a while, even though people had their suspicions. But in recent years, there have been a lot of new questions raised about that. So with that, why don't we dive into our story? So Natalie Wood, as we said, is a household name for many. She was a renowned actress. She had that old school Hollywood beauty from really the golden age of cinema. And she was known for starring in films such as we mentioned, Rebel Without a Cause, West Side Story, Splendor in the Grass, to name just a few. But she was much more than an actress. You know, we see these people in Hollywood, we see the image that they want to portray, and sometimes we forget. I mean, she was a daughter, she was a wife, she was a mother, and she was a friend to many. She was someone who was very much beloved in Hollywood, and that says a lot because Hollywood is a difficult place. It's a cutthroat place. It's a place where one person's success really can come at the cost of another. So the fact that so many people loved her, I think, says something about who she was. Now, she was not born Natalie Wood. Like so many people who go to Hollywood, that was her stage name. And all of you of Russian descent, I'm going to go ahead and ask for your forgiveness. But she was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938 in San Francisco, California. She was the daughter of Russian immigrants. Her family had a really interesting story, actually. They were very much involved in the revolution on the side of the White Russians. So White Russian is more than just a drink. It's also the people who opposed the Soviets back in the revolutionary period in Russian history. So you had the White Army and the Red Army. If you know your history, the Red Army won. So her family actually fled to China, started in Harbin, which is a fascinating place. If you ever get a chance to go to China, I've been to Harbin in the winter when it's like negative 50 degrees. They have this incredible ice festival where they build this entire city out of ice. It is unbelievable. If you ever get a chance to go, you should. And what's really interesting about Harbin, it's in Siberia and it's right on the border between China and Russia. So there's all this old Russian architecture. So you have this sort of the churches with the onion domes like you see in Red Square. It's this fascinating mix of Chinese and Russian culture. As a matter of fact, they get so few English speakers. My wife and I, we go there. Obviously, we don't speak Chinese. We go to a restaurant and, you know, we walk in. We're the only white people there. And they gave us a Russian menu because they just assumed we're Russian because that's the only white people they see in Harbin. It's hard to get to, but well worth it. Anyways, her family, they flee from Russia to Harbin. They go to Shanghai, and then they end up in the United States. And from a very early age, she is exhibiting talent. She's got charisma. She's cute as a button, and her family thinks she could be an actor. So at the age of 4, she earned her first role in the movie Happy Land after she won over the director with all that charm that we talked about. And a few years later, she got another role, this time in Tomorrow is Forever. Now, this was a small role, but like so many actors who are just getting into the business, sometimes it's those small roles where you kind of steal all the scenes that you're in that really give you your opportunity. And that was her. She captivated the audience and she earned herself another role. And this would be her first starring role. She played Susan Walker in Miracle on 34th Street when she debuted in 1947. And that was the one that really put her on the map. At age 16, she co-starred along with James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, earning herself an Academy Award nomination and really cementing herself as one of the great actresses of her age. And she would go on to star in many other films over the years, including The Searchers. She played a very minor role in that, but a very important role. Splendor in the Grass, West Side Story, Gypsy, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, Meteor, From Here to Eternity, The Last Married Couple in America, and Brainstorm, which would be her final film.
So Natalie's personal life was just as captivating to the public as her acting roles. She was known to date some of Hollywood's most elite, including Dennis Hopper, Nikki Hilton of the hotel chain, and Elvis Presley. I mean, everything about her captivated the world, right? Her acting skills, her beauty, her love life. She was truly just an embodiment of what we thought a starlet should be. But in 1957, her dating days were put to rest when, at 18 years old, Natalie wed 26-year-old Robert Wagner. But their marriage did not last long, and by 1962, the couple was divorced. And although star-studded, as you've heard, Natalie's life was far from perfect. Sadly, and this is probably something that happened to a lot of actresses back in the day, but may not have been reported, she was allegedly raped by a co-star when she was only 16 years old, but no report was ever made about that rape. And those closest to Natalie said this event haunted her throughout her life. You can imagine why that would be. It's one of the most invasive things that can happen to anyone. And her mental health was a constant struggle, whether due to the traumatic event of, sexual assault or just being in the limelight 24/7. Every inch of her was being scrutinized at all times. And those closest to her described her as being always near crisis. And this kind of state of always crisis ends up following her all the way to the grave.
And her friends knew about this sexual assault, this rape, for most of her life, but a lot of people didn't know who it was. After Kirk Douglas died, it was reported that he was the person who had assaulted her. Obviously, it's impossible to prove that definitively now, but I think everyone who knew Natalie thinks that's absolutely what happened. And, the Me Too movement sort of uncovered a lot of stuff in Hollywood and how abusive it can be, and I think that's probably been going on for a long time. Whatever the case, it certainly is true that Natalie's mental health struggles, her depression, it would catch up with her, and in 1966, she attempted suicide by swallowing sleeping pills. Luckily, there was a friend who was staying with her at the time who found her unresponsive, and as a matter of fact, she even told her friend that she was going to do this, and the friend got her help. I think this was more of a cry for help than anything. I mean, I hate to say it wasn't a real suicide attempt, but I think we've seen this before. A lot of times people who need help, but they don't know how to ask for it, they do something like this. She did this. She was taken to the hospital, and she had her stomach pumped, and she began receiving therapy, really the therapy that she needed. And she got a little bit better. And in 1969, she married again. This time it was to writer-producer Richard Gregson. The pair had a daughter, Natasha, who was born in 1970. But unfortunately, Richard had an affair. And not only did he have an affair, he had an affair with Natalie's own secretary, and the pair would end up divorcing in April of 1972. And that's when things took a bit of a shocking twist. So we talked about Robert Wagner, and we talked about how that relationship didn't work out. Well, it's 1972. She gets this divorce. Somehow, her and Robert reconnect. They're at a party. They see each other. They start talking, and whatever it was that had been the foundation of their past relationship is rekindled. And they are remarried in July 1972. So only a couple months after her divorce. And in 1974, they have their first child together, a daughter named Courtney. And at this point, Natalie decides she's going to take a step back from her career as an actress, and she's going to focus on her family. And really, for the next few years, she doesn't do a whole lot. She makes some cameo appearances. She does some television stuff, but nowhere near the kind of rigorous career she'd had before. She's really focusing on her family.
And so this period of time, she is, living what seems to be the blissful home life. By 1981, Natalie's children are a bit older, and she decides to go back to acting. And she was starring in a movie called Brainstorm alongside Christopher Walken. In late November 1981, Natalie and Robert were planning one of their many weekends out on their yacht called the Splendor to Catalina Island off the coast of California. The pair reportedly invited several friends, but all but one declined due to the poor sailing weather. And the one who came was Christopher Walken, Natalie's co-star. He, along with Robert and Natalie, go on this yacht with the boat's captain, Dennis Davern. What was supposed to be a fun, carefree weekend out on the water quickly turned tragic when Natalie went missing. And sadly, this beautiful starlet would never see shore again.
Are you looking for a new job or want a career change? Look no further than Monster.com. Need a little help standing out? Our expert resume writing services will make sure you shine. Want to brush up on your interview skills? Engage with our AI interview prep tool. Want some advice on negotiating your new salary? Visit our salary tools and extensive library of career advice articles, and you'll have all the tips and tricks you'll need to succeed. Visit Monster.com today and take the first step towards your career. Monster.com. Find your right job fit.
Okay, so let's walk through what happened. We'll go with the timeline. And We're going to give you sort of what's been publicly reported. We're going to give you what people say. But understand, everything about this is disputed. And the only people who actually know are the 4 people who were on that boat, only 3 of whom are still alive. So November 28th, 1981, 7 p.m., Robert Wagner, Natalie Wood, Christopher Walken, and Dennis Davern enjoyed a dinner at Doug's Harbor Reef in Catalina, California. So the group ate and drank throughout their time at Doug's to the point where the manager, Don Whiting, was concerned that they were too drunk to get back to the yacht safely on their dinghy. But, you know, when did such concerns ever stop anyone in a story like this from going ahead and doing what they were going to do anyways? So they're there for about 3.5 hours, eating and drinking the whole time. At around 10:30, the group leaves the restaurant and they head back to the yacht, which, as Alice said, was named the Splendor. Don Whiting asked the Harbor Patrol to make sure they arrived back safely. Now, you might think the Harbor Patrol would say, why are they boating if they're drunk? But no, they don't do that. So they head back to the boat. Natalie removed some of her jewelry and changed into her flannel nightgown, signaling that she was ready for bed.
So at 11 p.m., Marilyn Wayne, who was 80 feet away on another boat, reportedly heard a woman yelling in distress. She says that she and her boyfriend heard this woman shouting, "Somebody please help me, I'm drowning." And this went on for some time until about 11:30 p.m. And they tried to call the harbor master, but they got no response at the time. And you can imagine it's dark out there. Are they really hearing what they're hearing? Now, according to their story, the passengers on the yacht realize that Natalie is missing around 11:05, and they begin searching for her. And this is the time they also realize the dinghy is missing. Again, can't emphasize enough, all of this is disputed.
Now, I will say this. I realize these people have no reason to lie, the people who are nearby in the boat. But I will say, when I hear someone say that someone was shouting, "Somebody please help me, I'm drowning," I don't know that I actually believe that. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but generally speaking, when people are actually drowning, they don't actually do that. That's what they do in the movies, right? In the movies, people are making these very sort of coherent calls for help. In a true drowning, a lot of times they're completely silent, because the people are struggling and they can't actually make any noise. And I will tell you, I've told my story about the time I had to swim to the boat. So about halfway through that, I was in such distress that I actually decided I'm going to call for help to the people in the boat. And I couldn't do it because of I was struggling trying to swim. I couldn't really get anything out. And so at that point I was just like, I just got to go. I can't actually call for help. So the fact that this is so coherent, if it were just, I heard a woman scream, or even I heard a woman yell help, I think this is at least embellished. I think "Somebody please help me, I'm drowning" is at least embellished by this person who is claiming she heard this at this time. And you can think of reasons. Number one, she might lie because, you want to be part of the story. And she might embellish because she heard something less definitive and wants to make it sound more definitive.
Or she's unconsciously embellishing because her brain is interpreting what she now in hindsight realizes may have been the case, which may have been some amount of distress that was not those words, but what it's being interpreted in the post hoc reasoning is, oh, she must have been drowning. This is why we always say direct evidence is so spotty, because whether it was intentional embellishing or unconscious embellishing, we see this in storytelling all the time. This is why we always do follow-up questions in cross-examination, right? Someone says, "Oh my gosh, she screamed like someone was attacking her." Okay, well, that's pretty specific. What exactly did you hear? A high-pitched scream that lasted for 5 seconds. Okay, that's different. That can be interpreted in lots of different ways. Now, post-hoc, you can look back. You now know that she was being attacked. And now you're kind of colored by the fact that she was being attacked. But at the time, it could have been a scream of joy. Elation that she found her friend or her dog. So remember that when you hear someone saying something like this. I don't typically jump to their lying, but I do think the brain does a lot of strange things, especially when we now know something tragic happened and she may have heard something, but now her brain's adding more to it. Well, that scream must have been a cry for help, even if I didn't hear those words, but my brain is now interpreting it as such.
So whatever the case, at this point, people become concerned. So by 1:30 a.m., the people on the boat have been looking for her. They haven't found her. This is 2.5 hours later. They make a ship-to-shore call. Wagner gets on the radio and says someone is missing from our boat. And this is another one of those things. We talked about this all the way back in the John Benet Ramsey case, where initially John Benet's mom, she makes the 911 call and she says, we have a kidnapping. And she says, my daughter is missing. But she never says John Benet's name, and some people think that's significant. Same thing here. Some people think this is significant. Someone is missing from our boat. Doesn't use Natalie's name. You take that for what you will. If you think it's important, I think the facts are probably a little bit more important than the word choice, but nevertheless, it is something people have grabbed onto. So there are several people who hear this call and respond. There's a man named Paul Miller who was moored near the Splendor. Don Whiting, who we heard about earlier, he was the manager from Doug's Harbor Reef. He was apparently closing down at the time, and he and Bill Coleman, who was a cook from Doug's, all got in their boats and came out to help in the search. And they discovered it was Natalie who was missing. Another man who heard the call, Paul Wentler, went out to the Splendor to help. He actually picked up Wagner, and the pair went to the island to search for Natalie to see if maybe she had gone there or had ended up there, swam there. But there was no sign of her anywhere. At 2 a.m., Doug Bombard, who is the owner of Doug's Harbor Reef, he finds out about the situation. He alerts the harbor master, Doug Uden. Uden went out to the Splendor and convinced Wagner, who was very drunk, that they needed to make a call to the Coast Guard. And Wagner agreed, sometimes described as reluctantly.
What I'm thinking about this whole time is like, when you're on a boat, there's just like, if anyone's missing for any period of time, I just assume it's hopeless. This is a desperate situation. There are not many places for her to be. If Robert is pretty drunk, you can imagine there are only 4 people on the boat. You're on a boat. You have nowhere to drive to. You know, there's probably no problem typically with imbibing in alcohol, except if someone is now missing. At 3:25, finally the Coast Guard is called and alerted of the situation. And as you can imagine, it's like rough sailing waters. It's pitch black outside. Very difficult to do a search. So a full search for Natalie doesn't begin until 6 a.m., somewhere between like 7 or so hours after it's first reported that Natalie cannot be found. So around 7 or 7:30 a.m., the missing dinghy was located in a cove a mile from the yacht. So very close by. This is not far. It didn't take them long to find the dinghy. And it was empty, but its oars were in place, its engine was in neutral, and its ignition key was in the off position. So take that for what you will. It doesn't appear that it was going when someone fell out of it. Seems like it was in the position it would probably be in if it were still tied to the boat, for example. It wasn't probably being used whenever whoever was in the boat, if anyone was in the dinghy, left it.
Yeah, and look, there's several things that already stand out when you're looking at this. I mean, one of them is the timing of everything. So this is all taking a lot longer than it should. It's my initial thought. You know, they talk about they're searching for her. How much searching would you personally do before calling for help? You're on a boat. The person you're looking for is not on the boat. Yeah, I mean, if it were me, and, you know, I hate to like put myself in this position and act like this is the normal thing to do, but I feel like it is. I'd be calling everybody immediately. Like if I woke up, like just imagine the situation where you woke up and the person you love is not on your boat. I mean, what are you going to do? You look around the boat, you don't see her, you're going to start to freak out, right? I mean, aren't most people going to start to freak out? And you're going to want as much help as you can get. And it's dark, you know, and maybe she's out there treading water. How every second counts, right? And so I don't understand why everything took so long. I mean, you talk about this. I mean, they don't call the Coast Guard until 3:25. That's 4 hours, more than 4 hours after she went missing. I don't know. It's just the whole thing is.
It just seems like there's no place for her to be. She's on the boat or she's off the boat, right?
Or she's off the boat.
If she's off the boat, you're not going to survive very long. Most people cannot survive very long treading water for that long. You know, I can imagine a situation where, like, if you're on land at home, we see this sometimes where a child's missing and they're like, she's probably in the backyard, probably went next door, probably riding around the block. You can imagine there's like, okay, the child walked off. Let's wait a little bit longer before we call. Not on a boat. There's just better safe than sorry, right? Worst case scenario, she's passed out underneath, some sofa on the boat. But thank goodness, because what if she had been in the water treading water and she only has like 5 more minutes to tread before she goes under? But not here. We have to convince people to call the Coast Guard. That would probably be my first call.
And then you have the dinghy and the way the dinghy is found, which tells you, I think, one of two things happened. Either someone got in the dinghy, unhooked the dinghy from the boat, but then before they did anything with the dinghy, fell out of it. Or someone unhooked the dinghy from the boat, pushed it off so that it would look like somebody had taken the dinghy, and then it got carried into shore. I mean, the fact that everything is basically where you would expect it to be if the dinghy were still just attached to the boat, like the fact that it's not in the own position. Because if you were driving the dinghy, for instance, and fell out, and the dinghy kept going, well, the dinghy would still be, the engine would be in the own position, but it's not, right? So that whole thing is very strange as well, and I think tells you something about what happened. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it tells you something.
And also it makes sense if a dinghy is not going, that more time is needed for it to get farther away, right? Like if you unhook a dinghy and then you call the Coast Guard and they start searching within 10 to 15 minutes of the dinghy being unhooked, the dinghy's probably not going to be very far away. But give it about 7 hours, a mile, which is still very close relatively, but now it's a mile away and probably not spottable from the actual yacht. And also, unsurprisingly, we make another devastating find just 30 minutes after the dinghy is found. At 8 a.m., a helicopter is circling the area, part of the search, and they spot a red bubble in the ocean. Doug Bombard cruised to the nearby Blue Cavern Point to investigate what the helicopter saw, and when he arrived, his heart sank because it was Natalie's lifeless body floating in the water. She was wearing a red jacket, flannel nightgown, and wool socks. Now, officials boarded the Splendor to tell Natalie's husband, Robert Wagner, of her death. And he dropped his head and exclaimed, she's gone, oh God, she's gone, why? And Dennis Davern hugged Wagner, and Wagner asked Dennis to identify the body, claiming that he just couldn't do it because he was too overcome with emotion. Remember, there's another person on the boat as well. Christopher Walken walks into this scene and he exclaims, oh no, oh no. Now, the three of them are taken by a patrol boat to a nearby island, and Davern is the one to identify Natalie's body, while Wagner heads back to his house in Beverly Hills. And when he arrived back in Beverly Hills, he was immediately greeted by Detective Dwayne Rasher of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Now, Wagner is described as like too flustered at this time to provide any useful information, but he did say that the night had been uneventful leading up to Natalie's disappearance. Detective Rasher flew to the island to speak with Dennis Davern, the captain of the boat, and Davern spoke to another investigator originally, but he refused to talk to Detective Rasher without first speaking to an attorney. So that's interesting. Does talk to an investigator, but then some time passes and he refuses to talk to another investigator until he talks to an attorney. Now, ultimately, Wagner, Christopher Walken, and Dennis Davern all had similar accounts that they told to law enforcement. They all said the night leading up to Natalie's disappearance had been uneventful. None of them ever heard a woman calling for help. It was just a regular night. They never could have imagined what was to come.
So November 30th, 1981, Dr. Joseph Choi, who's the deputy medical examiner at the Los Angeles Medical Examiner's Office, performs an autopsy on Wood. The Huffington Post will later summarize his findings in an article. I'm going to read that to you. A recent diffuse, which means widespread bruise, measuring approximately 4 inches by 1 inch, spread over the lateral aspect of Natalie Wood's right arm above the wrist. On the left wrist was a slight, superficial, fresh bruise about a half an inch in diameter. Numerous small, superficial skin bruises measuring approximately a half to 1 inch in diameter were scattered over the right and left lower legs. they appeared to be relatively fresh. The left knee area showed a recent bruise measuring approximately 2 inches in diameter. The right ankle had a recent bruise measuring about 2 inches in diameter, and there was a small superficial bruise on the posterior aspect of both lower legs, each measuring a ½ inch to 2 inches. A vertical bruise type abrasion on the left cheek was the only head wound, and there were no deep traumatic injuries to the skull. Now, one thing you probably notice automatically is that's a lot of bruises. Apparently, at the time, Natalie was on a medication that made her bruise more easily. So that could be one reason for the bruises. But people are going to focus a lot on the bruises for obvious reasons in the years to come. So an examination of the clothing Natalie had worn that night revealed other significant facts. More than 24 hours after she had been found, the flannel nightgown, the wool socks, and the red down jacket were still wet. The doctor wrote, "I picked up the jacket and noted that it was extremely heavy, probably between 30 and 40 pounds in its saturated state. I also noted that a report from the toxicology laboratory revealed that the alcohol content of Natalie Wood's blood was 0.14%, 0.04% above the intoxication standard as set by the California Vehicular Code. Of course, now it's no longer 0.1, it's 0.08. So even a little bit more now. And look, 0.14 is not that drunk. You know, we've seen more in the Karen Reed case. She was speculated to be like 0.28 or something. I mean, you can be a lot more drunk than that. But you would, at that point, you wouldn't necessarily be making good decisions. You shouldn't be operating a vehicle, that sort of thing. You're not pass out or blackout drunk. You're not so drunk, for instance, that you would be standing on the railing of a boat, pass out, and flip into the water. That sort of thing's not going to happen, but it would affect sort of the way you're looking at things. From the toxicology report and the bruises, we were able to determine the probable cause of death. The vertical abrasion on her cheek told us that Natalie Wood, possibly attempting to board the dinghy, had fallen into the ocean, striking her face. Because she had sustained no deep traumatic head wounds, we knew she had been conscious while in the water. The bruises on her lower legs, I believed at the time, were incurred during her fall. The saddest part of the story, as far as I was concerned, was revealed in the clothing she had worn. The reason she drowned was the great weight of the jacket, which had pulled her down when she attempted to climb into the dinghy. If she had just taken off the jacket, she might easily have made it into the dinghy and survived. The reason she hadn't removed the killing jacket, as he refers to it, was suggested in the report from the toxicology lab. That 0.14% of alcohol in her blood was, I believed, a deadly factor. She couldn't have been thinking clearly, or she would have slipped off the jacket at once. Which, I mean, look, that's easy to say. Even if you were sober, falling into the cold water in a November night, I could imagine you're not thinking clearly. You might not think to slip off the jacket until it's too late. She would not be the first person in a situation like that who doesn't do the thing that someone sitting and thinking about it thinks she should do. Either way, at this point, they classify Natalie's death as an accident, and the investigation comes to an end.
So this red killing coat is really, really interesting, right? So the story we hear from earlier in the night is she goes to her room and gets ready for bed. That's why she's in her nightgown, wool socks, and I don't know her bedtime routine, but most people probably don't go to bed in a coat. You usually go to bed in your nightgown. And so if you're getting changed in your bedroom or where you're going to sleep for the night, there's really no need to put on a coat if you're not going to go outside. But you put on a coat because it is a cold night. If you were to step outside to have a conversation, have a smoke, get in a dinghy, I don't know what would bring her to a dinghy when she's already changing for the night to go to bed. So the fact that the coat is so heavy and it's on her when she's found leads me to believe that it was probably not put on her, right? She was wearing the coat when she fell into the water because it is too heavy, too cumbersome, if you want to talk about foul play, for someone to put something on her to make her way down, in other words. But I don't think that the whole first part of the story that we talked about when we said that everything's in dispute, that her going to her bedroom to get ready for bed and that's all anyone heard for the night until all of a sudden they woke up and she couldn't be found, seems like the whole story, because something made her put a coat on in order to go out after she was ready to go to bed. Because if you imagine you're going to have a smoke before going to bed, or you're going to, I don't know that she smoked, but you were going to do something outside before going to bed, you would probably not change into your nightgown first. You would finish it up, like if you're on a fire, finish out your cigarette, finish out your cigar, finish out your bourbon before you go change for the night. Usually when you go change for the night, you're done for the night. You're not coming back out. So this indicates to me that she did leave her room, and you typically leave your room. There's only 4 people on the boat. So did someone see her leave her room? Was there a reason for her to leave her room after she was getting ready for bed? Someone to call her out, or some reason for her to take that coat and come back out? This jacket is like something that I cannot stop thinking about, partly because it's the killing coat, right? I mean, if she maybe didn't have this coat on, who knows? Who knows what the conditions were? She may have been able to grab onto something and float, even if there was such a delay in calling the Coast Guard. She may have been able to float to safety or been able to hang on until someone found her. But why was this coat on? Because that tells, I think, a really important missing part of the story. Who was she talking to? Why was she putting on a coat to come out after she was getting ready for bed?
One of the reasons that I don't really buy a lot of police conspiracy theories is because police, I'm not going to say they're lazy, but they are overworked. And they're often, trying to close cases. And so the idea that they're going to put all this effort into fabricating this massive conspiracy, I usually find to be very unbelievable. Maybe worst case, they're going to do something like plant some evidence real quick to make their job simpler and solve the case. And you see a case like this, and it's hard for me not to think that it was just easier to accept the story. You got these 2 famous guys on the boat. They're telling you this story. It roughly lines up with the bruises. Let's just close the book and move on. Because if you look at this story for more than a couple minutes, it starts to all kind of fall apart. And you start to ask yourself all sorts of things and wonder why things weren't followed up on. And I feel like you see that so much when you start looking at this case. It just feels like, man, you guys should have done a little bit more here. You really closed the book on this one way too soon. And no matter what happened, it does not feel like this case was investigated thoroughly at all.
So on December 3rd, 1981, Natalie is buried at Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles, and her funeral was attended by roughly 100 people. There were eulogies by actress Hope Lang, author Thomas Thompson, and actor Roddy McDowell. The honorary pallbearers at the funeral included Laurence Olivier, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, Gregory Peck, and Frank Sinatra. The honorary pallbearers at the funeral included Laurence Olivier, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, Gregory Peck, and Frank Sinatra. I mean, literally the who's who of this golden age of cinema. And I mean, it is a gripping loss because she is returning from kind of her step away from acting. She's still in her prime. She's still beautiful. She's still captivating in every way. And her life is cut short so suddenly and seemingly in an accident. On September 1st, 1997, 16 years after Natalie's death, Christopher Walken spoke about the evening in an interview with Playboy, and he said, this is not going to be surprising, it's going to be different than what he said 16 years earlier. He said, quote, "Anybody there saw the logistics of the boat, the night where we were, that it was raining, and would know exactly what happened. You hear about things happening to people. They slip in the bathtub, fall down the stairs, step off the curb in London because they think that the cars come the other way, and they die. You feel you want to die making an effort at something. You don't want to die in some unnecessary way. What happened that night, only she knows, because she was alone. She'd gone to bed before us, and her room was at the back. A dinghy was bouncing against the side of the boat, and I think she went out to move it. There was a ski ramp that was partially in the water. It was slippery. I'd walked on it myself. She had told me she couldn't swim. In fact, they had to cut a swimming scene from Brainstorm. She was probably half asleep, and she was wearing a coat." Now, this statement is consistent with that story that investigators were like, yeah, that's probably what happened. It's interesting because it's like a whole narrative on what could have happened. None of it like necessarily rooted in any fact, but it sounds a story. It sounds like a film scene rather than reality. Because the whole point here, right, is I don't know what happened. But he said a lot of what may have happened.
He said a lot for somebody who was supposedly asleep when everything happened. And then he's like, oh, the boat was banging up against the thing.
It was slippery. Okay. We had to cut a swimming scene. She had a coat on. Like, when I say this is not what he told investigators, what he told investigators was like, nothing out of the ordinary. Don't know anything. But this literally reads like a page out of a movie script. And it's just so interesting to have all of these details that are not supported by the investigation or anything he said at the time either.
And let me just say, do we really think Natalie Wood, who can't swim, in the middle of the night, when it's cold, when she's half asleep and had a lot to drink, would get in the dinghy to what? Move it somewhere? Like, she's going to
go parallel park it somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, she's going to tie it up to a different part of the boat? Or would she just knock on the captain's door and say like, hey man, that I'm paying to do this, can you move the dinghy? It's banging up against the thing. It's keeping me awake.
Or they go out on their yacht all the time. That's always her bedroom. She's either used to this banging or she knows it's going to bang and they would have moved it ahead of time. This is not the first time they've been on this yacht. This is their yacht. They go on this yacht all the time. This is always her bedroom. You know, like this just seems so, why now? Why today? Why this day? Why is it bothering her this day of all days?
So the story up to this point is nothing unusual happened and then Natalie Wood fell into the water and drowned. That's the story. But it all starts to fall apart in 2009. So that year, Dennis Davern and Marty Rulli published a book called Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendor that detailed Davern's recollection of the events the evening that Natalie died. He would now say that he, in fact, lied to investigators when he was initially questioned. His new story was there was a fight. Natalie and Robert had gotten into a terrible argument, and it ended in Robert smashing a wine bottle on the coffee table. At that point, not wanting to be involved, Christopher Walken went to his cabin and went to bed. Natalie was horrified by all this and also decided to go to bed, but Wagner was so angry that he was irate and he followed her. The argument continued and Davern tried to break it up, but Wagner told him to go away. A few minutes later, Natalie was missing. Davern didn't see what happened. He wasn't there. He went away as was told, but eventually she goes missing. And when he was notified, he wanted to make immediate attempts to find her. He wanted to turn on the searchlight. He wanted to call authorities, but Wagner asked him not to. Now, details are sparse. Like, why would he ask him not to? There's going to be another story that's told as well that would help explain that. The story feels more real, but it's still missing a lot. And you got to remember, there were 4 people on this boat, right? Davern is already telling you, I lied initially. Now he's telling you this story, which tells you a lot more. But remember, what is something people tend to do when they tell a story about a crime that they are involved in? They tend to minimize. So it's still very much like, oh, this stuff was happening, but I wasn't there when it was happening. And then this bad thing happened and there was some weird stuff and I don't know what happened, is essentially what he's saying.
Exactly. I mean, definitely a bombshell. We'll say that much. And definitely some major gaps and holes. It's interesting because those gaps, there's probably something in them for him to be able to tell this whole story. That's what happens when you minimize, right? Like, here's the whole story. It doesn't make sense because these gaps are in there. And those gaps are there because that's probably my role. I'm not saying he was there, but he probably saw a lot more than he's saying that he did, which is why he can draw these connections of what's happening.
So things start to move now. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopens Natalie's case after receiving additional information from an unnamed source. I don't think it's hard to figure out who the sources are in this. Lana Wood, who was Natalie's sister and who actually stood in for her. You remember the movie Brainstorm they were making at the time. They finished that movie and it was released. Natalie had already recorded most of her scenes. Lana would stand in for her for the few scenes that they needed so they could finish the movie. She would say that years after this happened, Davern called her and she said she didn't know him. She never talked to him, but he just called her out of the blue and told her that he had been there when Natalie fell overboard. It was during this argument, and that it was Robert shoved her, or he either shoved her over the boat or he shoved her, and at some point after that, she stumbled and fell over the boat. Either way, according to Lana, he told Davern, leave her there, it'll teach her a lesson. And so that is more fulsome than what he's saying in the book. Because in the book, he's just saying, oh, just all of a sudden she wasn't there, and I wanted to look for her, and Wagner didn't want to. This actually makes a lot more sense, what she's saying, than what he initially said. But he's never said that publicly. So he wrote the book. He's going to do an interview with NBC's Today Show, and he says the same thing he says in the book. I lied originally. He tells that same story that's in the book, and he urges investigators to take another look at the case. Is the story that Lana is telling true or not? I don't know. You know, the one thing I'll say, you see this sometimes in cases where a family member will tell a story that is just kind of mind-blowing if it's true. And sometimes you wonder if they're doing that to get the police to act, more so than that's what actually happened. And I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it is interesting that you have Davern, who's now telling the story. And after he tells the story, starts to tell the story, Lana comes forward with this version that I don't think she had said before. And now she's got this new version as he's telling his story, but he's not supporting it. But either way, it's obvious now something very different from what we were told happened on that boat.
And the reason that at least what Lana is saying rings more true than Davern's, or at least more complete than Davern's version, is, remember, we knew that Robert was very drunk. And you can imagine, like, how do you get two other people to lie, right? We know their stories were all the same. At some point, people are like, I need to talk to an attorney. But they got their stories straight. We've seen this before in other cases, like the Robert Wong case, when three people's stories all align, and likely that story is not true. Why would you do that? How can you convince someone to do that? Something that's criminal, to lie. Is if you're really drunk, you didn't mean to kill her. And you can imagine in any more of a sober state, realizing that if someone's overboard, you can't just leave them there to teach them a lesson. You're not teaching them a lesson. You're probably killing them, right? But perhaps in that very moment, he didn't have the mens rea to like murder her. The effects of his actions ended up that she was dead. But you can imagine him being like, of course I didn't mean to. We were all drunk. We didn't know what was going on. Well, you didn't look for her. You didn't jump in after her. Like, Christopher, you didn't walk away. We all saw her in there. This is just as much your fault as mine, right? You can imagine some sort of like guilt all being together of not doing more when they were probably all similarly drunk in some way because they were all eating together. I don't know the intent, but something like that I can imagine can bind people together to lie and do something illegal.
Yeah, and look, I mean, they all had a lot to lose here. And if they all were involved in this somehow tangentially, then you could imagine this scenario going down. It's almost like a I Know What You Did Last Summer scenario. And they had plenty of time. Because as we said, from the moment she went missing, supposedly, and the moment they call for help, a lot of time passes. You know, you mentioned Robert Wan. They had more time than the people in Robert Wan did to get their story straight. And they all end up telling the same story.
So January 14th, 2013, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department officially changed Natalie's cause of death from an accidental drowning to, quote, drowning and other undetermined factors. The change stemmed from investigators' determination that some of the bruising on her body may have been sustained before she drowned, though coroners couldn't confirm exactly when. Now, nothing changed about the autopsy, right? Like, we already knew these bruises existed before. It's not like they exhumed her body and were like, well, these bruises really predated the drowning. I think now that they have other stories, this is where I think maybe a little bit of the lazy investigating may have come into play. They're like, well, now with the story out there, it's pretty bad because that's a lot of bruising. And if there really was a fight aboard, you can imagine, grabbing wrists, grabbing, faces, a slap. That can cause not traumatic injuries that would cause any sort of a death, but maybe indicative of what happened before she ended up in the water. On February 1st, 2018, so things are not moving quickly here, the authorities announced in an interview with 48 Hours that Robert Wagner is a person of interest in Natalie's death. Only took 10 years after these revelations are made in order to announce that. In May 2022, though, Robert Wagner was cleared by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. This is so interesting because we've always said you don't have to announce. The authorities never have to announce who's a suspect. In fact, most of the time they don't. So to do it so publicly on a show seems very Hollywood-esque, like it's part of a movie. And then for someone to be announced so publicly to be the person of interest, to then be cleared about 4 years later is even more curious. Like, it's not great for law enforcement for them to publicly announce on like a TV show, not even in like a official law enforcement press release, that Robert Wagner is a person of interest. For them to then say in this statement, this was said by Lieutenant Hugo Reinaga, all leads in the Natalie Wood case have been exhausted and the case remains an open, unsolved case. If additional leads surface in the future which have not already been investigated, the case will be reassigned to a detective to investigate the new leads. In other words, they were closing the case. There's not going to be new leads. There were 4 people on that boat. 1 is dead. 1 has now said that they lied, and 1 was declared a person of interest. There's only so many people.
And let me just say this. The reporting on this is always that Robert Wagner was cleared. And I object to that reporting because if the case is still open and we don't know what happened and there were 3 other people on that boat, how has he been cleared? Was there a video that surfaced of him going to bed when she was still alive? Because unless that's what happened, he hasn't been cleared. Even if they talked to everybody on the boat and they said, oh, he had nothing to do with it, he still hasn't been cleared. If it's an open case, he is still a suspect in this case. And I've got to feel there's a lot of PR going on here. And it's California, it's Hollywood. These are all, important people. I don't buy the story that we're being told. So we're going to get into theories, but just one, sort of tragic thing about this case. Robert and Natalie were actually married on a boat off of Catalina Island. So a lot of sort of tragic coincidence there. So what happened? Well, look, there are only a couple real theories in this case. I'll go ahead and throw out one that I think obviously didn't happen, and that's suicide. So Natalie had a history of mental health struggles. She did have this previous suicide attempt, though very clearly it was a cry for help. That has led some people to believe that this was a suicide. There's a few problems with this. Number one, it doesn't really account for the bruises on her body, and this would be a very strange way for her to kill herself. She was terrified of water, and in fact, it's said that a fortune teller told either her or her mother, depending on the story you believe, that she would drown one day, that is how she would die. And that was one of the reasons she was so afraid of water. So we've talked about suicide before. It can happen in strange ways that are unexpected, that don't always make sense to people who are thinking rationally, because a lot of times suicide is the result of irrational thinking. Number one, there's no evidence of it. Number two, it seems like a very strange way for her to do that. And number three, there's a lot of evidence that something else happened. So I think we can kick suicide out as our potential theory. The other one is accidental drowning. And this was the conclusion that was reached in the initial investigation. Natalie drowned accidentally. Perhaps she tried to get in the dinghy and fell and hit her head. And unfortunately, due to the weight of her jacket, she did drown. As we said, she didn't know how to swim well. She had been drinking that evening. Now, it is true that typically she would not go out in the dinghy alone. It is said that she, in fact, did not even know how to operate it, and she was afraid of dark water. Maybe because she'd been drinking, it lowered her inhibitions. She just wanted to get that dinghy moved for whatever reason, and she decided to do so. Maybe they did get in a fight, and it wasn't that he pushed her or anything. She was just upset. And she just wanted to get away. She just wanted to get away from the boat. She wasn't thinking clearly. She tried to get in the dinghy. She fell, hit her head, and drowned. That is a possibility, and it is certainly one that a lot of people, including the people who initially looked at this case, believed.
But there are just so many unsatisfying holes in that. While my inhibitions may be lowered if I've been drinking, my fears only get heightened. Like, I am more scared of things and I actually overreact. I'm like, I don't know. I definitely don't want to talk about ghosts tonight, Brett. Like, and this is not something that has happened before. She's on this yacht all the time. She's familiar with this dinghy. She never operates this dinghy. The dinghy's always tied back there. Her room is always back there. There is nothing unusual about this event. This is not a once in a lifetime event. This isn't a special evening. The thing about this is it feels so rote of her usual life, but something extraordinary happens this night, which is why it really doesn't feel like an accident to me, because she drinks on the boat. She sleeps on the boat. This is just what she does. So she's not in an unfamiliar place where she doesn't know how to operate things, doesn't know that the boat ramp is slippery. It is incredibly dark at 11 p.m. at night. This is what she's afraid of, right? She has people who do things for her. Lots of people who do things for her. She doesn't need to be the one to move a dinghy, especially if she can't operate the dinghy herself. What is she going to do? Drag it around to the other side and tie it from aboard? No, you can't do that with a dinghy. And so this leads us to the theory that shouldn't be surprising because he was announced as a person of interest, that Robert Wagner was the one who murdered Natalie Wood. So many people believe this theory that Robert murdered Natalie because he was in a jealous rage that evening. Remember, they've had a volatile relationship already. They got married young. She was only 18. They divorced. And then they had this whirlwind rekindling of their passion where they get remarried within a couple months of her second divorce. Now, the captain of the ship, Davern, would, years after the incident, change his story, as we've heard, to suggest that Natalie had been flirting with her co-star Christopher Walken all weekend. Remember, she's been essentially a housewife, a stay-at-home mom for almost a decade, after having been a starlet, the Hollywood star of everyone's dreams. And here she is re-entering that stardom with Christopher Walken as her co-star in Brainstorm. And it's reported that Robert was furious about this. We keep saying there were just 4 people on the boat. Christopher Walken was one of them. Now, the ship's captain even suggested that Walken and Wagner were in a fight over his flirtation with Natalie, so that there were heated emotions all around, not just from Robert directed at Natalie, but that there was tension even between Christopher Walken and Robert Wagner. Now, the people who are proponents of this theory point to several factors. Wagner reportedly lied to police in the initial investigation. He told police that Natalie probably tried to get in the dinghy to go party hopping. Okay, we think this is pretty unlikely for several reasons. While she had a beautiful red coat on, she was in her nightgown, in a flannel nightgown. If she's going to go party hopping, she will be photographed. She's probably not going to be in a nightgown and wool socks because you look like you escaped from the mental ward, if that's the case. Number 2, Natalie did not know how to operate the dinghy. So how is she going to go party hopping? She's not going to row herself there. Certainly not. How's she going to tie up the boat when she gets to the dock? How can she see? She's in her nightgown. She's in for the night. She's not going party hopping. 3, we know that Natalie had a phobia of dark water ever since that fortune teller told her mother that she would die by drowning. And 4, we know that Natalie couldn't swim well. This was well known. I don't think she could swim really at all. So why would this be her way of going party hopping? According to the ship captain Davern, once it became clear that Natalie was missing, Wagner did not want to make an effort to locate her. Robert and Natalie were reportedly fighting that evening, and they did have this troubled relationship. And it may have been your usual Hollywood type of tumult within a relationship, but something more happened that night. Despite the initial reports by the 3 alive witnesses on the boat, I don't think it was a regular evening where there was nothing to see. And in fact, Robert would eventually admit that he had in fact been jealous of Natalie and Christopher Walken and had gotten into a fight with Wood about it. He also confirmed that he did smash a wine bottle. Okay, we're hearing some consistencies now with Davern's new story. But he claimed to police at the time it was smashed in rough seas. So he wasn't the one who smashed it in anger. It was just the sailing weather was bad. And the wine bottle was smashed, the passive voice, right? Wagner claimed, however, that he was primarily in an argument with Christopher Walken and that Natalie was the one who left as that fight between Robert and Christopher Walken escalated. They then continued this argument on the deck, and Davern agreed that the argument did spill onto the deck, but claimed that Natalie intervened, leading to a worse argument between the two of them. He then put on loud music, and the next thing he knew, Natalie was nowhere to be found.
And I feel like we're starting to see as people start talking more and more, we're starting to see what happened. And you see this in cases, like you often, you'll see this in other cases where the more police talk to someone, the more their story changes. And sometimes people will say, well, why would they say that? Why would they admit to that? They must have been coerced or something, right? That's the only reason that would happen. Otherwise, they would stick to their original story. And that's just not true, because people feel like they can talk their way out of things. Robert Wagner would have been best to have shut up and just never talked about this case. But as the pressure kept mounting and people kept saying things, and these comments are relatively recent, he finally does an interview and sort of admits that a lot of the things that Davern said are true. So we now know this was not just an ordinary night. We know, Christopher Walken wasn't telling the truth when he said he just went to bed, no biggie, right? No, there was a fight that night, and it was about his jealousy and him thinking that Natalie and Christopher Walken were flirting with each other. And whatever else happened, he smashed that wine bottle. It got heated. And Davern now says, I put on the music and just to basically ignore it. Like, I didn't want to be a part of this. And he kind of says, look, I was the employee. It wasn't my place. So I put on the music just to drown it out, what was happening. And I think what happened at that point is kind of hard to say. I have my theory that I'll share when this is over. But certainly the fight led to her death. It either led to her death because she was pushed off that boat, or because Robert Wagner did something, or because she was trying to get away. I think one of those two things happened. I think she was either getting in that dinghy to get away from him, or something else happened.
So Natalie's sister Lana provided the following theory in her book. She believes that Robert and Natalie, quote, had an alcohol-fueled argument that escalated into a physical confrontation, and that Robert delivered a blow to the left side of Natalie's face that knocked her unconscious. She continues that suddenly panic-stricken when he realized what he'd done, Robert made the fatal decision to put Natalie in the water to avoid being held responsible for what had happened. And when Davern intervened, she believes that Robert sent him to look for Natalie to give himself time to untie the dinghy to make it look like Natalie had tried to get away in a dinghy and fell in the process.
So I don't think that's what happened. I'll say this. I don't think this was an intentional murder. I don't think he was trying to cover anything up. Because let's be clear. If Robert Wagner had slapped her and knocked her unconscious in 1981, nothing would have happened to him. He didn't have to cover this up with a murder. Nothing happened to him when she died. Nothing was going to happen to him for this. He could have gotten away with that. So I don't think that's what happened. But I do think the basic story that Davern told is true. I think that they got into a big, and I think they all know it. I think Christopher Walken knows it. I think Wagner obviously knows it. I think Davern knows it. I think Lana is telling the truth when she says that Davern called her. I think that they got into this huge fight. I think he pushed her, and I think she fell off the boat. I think she fell off the boat into the water, and he said something like, it'll teach her a lesson, right? And nobody helped her. And I think at some point, by the time they were ready to help her, the noises stopped, the yelling stopped. I don't think she was yelling, I'm drowning. But I do think that lady heard her screams for help, because I think those were real. And I think at some point they realized that she was gone. And then I think somebody decided to undo that dinghy and push it off to make this story about how they were going to move the dinghy, and then the rest sort of fell into place. That's what I think happened based on this. Obviously, it's speculation. I can't prove it. I don't think you'll ever be able to prove it, but given what we know now, that is much more likely than she, of her own volition, decided to get in that dinghy and then something happened.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Brett. I don't think it was premeditated. I think it was rage-filled anger, and that he said something along the lines as he probably pushed her or slapped her and she fell over. Leave her, and she's screaming from there. And I think all three of them could have helped her. And that's why they all initially lied. I think that's why Christopher Walken, so many decades later, gives that weird story in Playboy. I mean, if my good friend died on a boat, I couldn't talk so flippantly about it. Like, we all want our deaths to mean something, but sometimes we're stupid and sometimes we slip and fall when we know better and it's just our own damn fault. That's what his story sounds like to me. And you have to do that when there is some more knowledge and need for emotional and mental distancing to maintain your sanity. And I think it's because all three of them had the opportunity to save them, whether Robert would have let him or not, right? I can imagine Davern be like, hey, we should really throw her, a life preserver. And Robert even pushing him, being like, this is none of your business. I can imagine that. But I think the reason this story is just now coming out, and the reason it's coming out, we've talked about conspiracies all the time. It's really hard to keep a conspiracy, is that all three have direct knowledge. I don't think that Davern has all those holes in his story. I think he has direct knowledge of what happened. I think Christopher Walken did not go to his room and see nothing. I think all three know exactly what happened. And because of that, this story is able to come out so many decades later. If any of them didn't see the whole thing, I don't think they would know enough or want to risk enough so many decades later for the truth to eke out. But something like this will eat you up inside. And unfortunately, I don't think this was some premeditated, conspiracy for all three of them to murder her and cover it up. Nothing like that. But I think very conscious decisions were made, whether in an alcohol-induced stage or not. But each of them made decisions that ended with her death. And that is a heavy, heavy burden. And that's probably why it's an open case. And that's probably why charges will never be brought. Because there are likely 3 people who know what happened. And I don't know that there will be enough for charges to be brought against any of them.
And I think Davern, for whatever reason, told the closest to the real story. And it could be because, he feels guilty. And look, it's possible, though I think it's unlikely, that, they got into a fight and Christopher Walken was like, I'm out. And he goes to his room and goes to sleep. And it's possible that Davern was like, I don't want to be any part of this. And he goes over and he's playing his music and he doesn't hear. But it is hard for me to believe that any of them didn't know after she went in the water. That's just hard for me to believe. However that went down, it's just hard for me to believe. Or that they didn't all find out. And one of the reasons why it's hard for me to believe, they clearly got their story together. None of them, not Christopher Walken, not Robert Wagner, not Davern, told the police there was a big fight and she was upset, because that's important, right? If that were true, that's a really important part of the story, because it could tell you why she got in the dinghy. Even if it's a pure accident. Why'd she get in the dinghy? Why would she do that? Christopher Walken comes up with this cockamamie story that she was moving it because it was bumping against the boat. That's absurd. That's stupid. She wouldn't have done that. Especially not that drunk, but even if she was much more drunk, she wouldn't have done that. But that's the story he comes up with because he's trying to come up with something that makes sense. The other thing that makes sense is she was so upset she wanted to get away from the boat. They didn't tell the police that. None of them did, which means for some reason they all got together while she was out there in the water before they called the Coast Guard or called out to shore for help. They had gotten together and decided, when we tell this story, this is the story we're going to tell. And all of them agreed to do that. Why would they do that if they had no knowledge, no involvement, and if it was a simple accident? Why would they agree to change their story? All of them, not just Robert, all of them, including the guy who supposedly was asleep when it happened. That doesn't make any sense.
And also, I think they were all aware, at least, of the decision to let the dinghy go. I think the dinghy had nothing to do with Natalie ending up in the water. She didn't get near that dinghy. She didn't care. Why would Christopher Walken's story to Playboy a decade later talk about the dinghy banging against the boat. How would he know? Was he in Natalie's room? What was happening? How the heck would he know what is happening in her room? That dinghy was part of the plan to make it look like it was her fault.
And if she fell into the water, why was the dinghy not still attached to the boat? Like if she was like getting down there to get in the dinghy and slipped off the ramp, like he was saying, and fell in the water, the dinghy should still be there. How did the dinghy get separated from the boat? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, especially when the oars aren't moved. It's in neutral. So let's say she made it into the dinghy. What, then she tipped out of it? That makes no sense. How did she untie it?
Fell out.
And then just fell out when she's already on sturdy ground? What does the slippery boat dock have anything to do with it, Christopher Walken?
Right.
Like, why talk about that? Since clearly it had nothing to do with the boat dock. She didn't slip, untie, then fall into the water. She was just fine on that slippery boat ramp if, in fact, she made it to the dinghy to untie it. But you know what happens when you fall trying to get into a dinghy? First of all, it's still tied. But the oars will be amiss. Things will look strange with the dinghy. You'll hear it because the dinghy's loud. You just said it was loud. It was banging against the side of the yacht. So you give a little too much detail that is a bit unnecessary in that interview that seems to point to trying to convince us of a story that doesn't exist.
And if she was standing in the dinghy, imagine she gets into the dinghy, she undoes the dinghy, and she's getting ready to like turn the dinghy on and move away, and then falls into the water. Where'd the bruises come from? Did she fall in the dinghy first, get bruised up, then stand up, then fall out of the dinghy? I mean, all these things, these pieces of evidence do not line up with this story. It lines up much better if she was being assaulted by somebody, hit something as she's going over the edge, maybe hit things on her way down, ended up in the water. That makes a lot more sense about how she got all these different bruises than she somehow fell out of the dinghy. So I wish, I don't know. I mean, I'm glad the police took a deeper look at this case. I wish there was some way for them to take an even more in-depth look at this case. I recognize there's just not evidence unless you really need somebody, one of these three, to have told somebody else, and which you kind of have with the whole Lana story. But unless one of them cracks, or Robert Wagner on his deathbed confesses, or somebody else does, we'll probably never know exactly what happened. But I feel pretty confident that I do know what happened that night. And either way, rest in peace, Natalie Wood. Okay, guys.
Whew, that was sad.
Yeah, that's a sad one. It's a tragic Hollywood story, but it's all too human, right? I mean, the kind of thing that you can imagine happening in any jealous, abusive relationship, but it's one that we all know about because Natalie Wood. So, okay, guys, well, I hope you enjoyed that story. If you have thoughts or theories or questions, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. This was a case suggested, like so many cases. Send us an email to do that. It's the best way to get on the list, and we will cover your case eventually. Well, Alice, do you want to answer one question before we sign off?
Sure, absolutely.
So as we've said many times, if you leave a 5-star review and leave a question, we will answer it for you on this podcast. And this week we have a nice light question to go with the darkness of the story we just talked about. So Alice, this is from Jazz Mouse, who wants to know, if you could only ever have one type of cheese again, which type would you pick and why?
Only one type of cheese?
Only one type of cheese.
That's so hard because there's like cooking cheese and then there's like snack cheese and there's night cheese. The thing. You know?
Pizza cheese, Mexican cheese, pizza cheese dip.
This is hard. Okay, this is really hard because I really like to cook with cheese too. And like, I don't eat feta cheese, for example, like by itself. Sometimes I do. But like feta cheese can heighten so many dishes. Like roasted cabbage with some feta and roasted pumpkin seeds, like divine, right? But I'm not going to sit there and probably eat a block of feta cheese. But then like, if I don't have melted Gouda with my night cheese, what am I going to do? Guys, why would you ask me to choose? I'm very distressed right now.
This is a tough one.
I don't like this question at all. I love goat cheese. I do love goat cheese to eat with crackers. So I could eat goat cheese as my night cheese. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a great scene by Tina Fey in 30 Rock where she talks about eating her night cheese. That's what I'm talking about. when you just need a little pick-me-up at night and you eat a little night cheese. So you could eat goat cheese as night cheese and cook with goat cheese. That's pretty good too. And you can heat it up. And you can put it on pizza. Oh my gosh, I don't know. I need something versatile because I eat it on so many things. I'm going to go with goat cheese because you can eat it plain, heated, like on a pizza, and you can cook with it to elevate a dish. I don't like this question at all. I'm feeling very panicked right now.
I think I would go with mozzarella for similar reasons. You can do
delicious.
a lot. You can do a lot with mozzarella. You know, it's important that it be a cheese that you can put on pizza. I feel like, you know, and I feel like if you do mozzarella, you get like fresh mozzarella and buffalo mozzarella and like all the different kinds of mozzarella. But that's a hard question.
That's baby Brittany's favorite food, shredded mozzarella.
Yeah.
She doesn't eat anything. She's like monastic. But boy, does she go to town on shredded mozzarella, man.
Yeah, that's a great question. We want to know your answer to that question.
I feel very, very anxious thinking about not getting to eat the rest of the cheeses for the rest of my life.
One cheese, that's tough. That's tough because, you know, Swiss cheese is so great on all your sandwiches.
Could we all live in a commune and each pick a different cheese so we can share?
There you go. There you go. So let us know which cheese you can't live without. Can't wait to hear from you. Thank you to all our patrons who joined us tonight. If you want to hear these episodes early and ad-free or want to join us for a live recording, do join Patreon. I do want to say we're recording this in October, so I want to give a shout out to Jason for the Silver Linings Handbook? Playbook? Handbook. I always get it wrong. Silver Linings Handbook. I was on his show for Halloween. We had a great discussion about mysteries. Really enjoyed it. Also to Vintage Villains, who Allison Dixon, who many of you know, she hosts that show. I was on that show as well in October. So if you somehow missed those two shows, go back and listen to them. They're a lot of fun. Silver Linings Handbook. Check it out. Okay, Alice. Anything else you want to share before we sign off?
No, this is... Well, I know we thought this was going to be a multi-parter, but I felt like we needed to wrap it all up for Natalie in one. So you got an extra long episode, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. People have asked us to do this case for a very long time, and I hadn't looked into it until now, but I question all my, I used to think Christopher Walken was funny, but now I think my view has changed.
I will say this. Going into this, I assumed this was an accident and people were just being conspiratorial. But then when you look at it, you're like, yeah, there's a lot going on here. So... Yeah. I mean, it could have been an accident. I'm not saying that's impossible.
I think it's in part accident, right? Like that's part of it. Is it's not. I don't think it's premeditated. Which, for some people, that could be the distinguishing line. But if you don't take life-saving measures when you can, you are guilty.
The fact that there is, at best, I guess at best it was a pure accident. But either way, as Alice said, there is an accident, a part of it. I think that's what makes it so hard to solve. I think you're right. I think the fact that it's an accident in some way makes it harder to determine whether or not there was a criminal element or not. But hey, it's an open case, so if you got any information, send it to the police. It's not too late to get justice. All right, guys. Well, we will see you next week with a new case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
Awesome. Well, oh my.
It doesn't rain on Saturday. I'll be good.
It's going to rain on Saturday?
I hope not.
Oh, not. Let me see. Looks like it's just tomorrow, thankfully, which is fine because we have soccer tomorrow. And if soccer gets canceled, it's not the worst thing.
Yeah. But I can tell you, the tide's rolling in on Georgia. That's going to happen. It's a hurricane or a football game. It's happening one way or the other.
You are funny. Okay, guys. be back tomorrow.
All right, guys. We'll see you tomorrow. Have fun.
Indeed.
Thank y'all
Thanks
for
for
sticking it
coming.
out. Stay safe. Be good. Be kind. And don't litter. All right. See y'all later. Bye.
You're funny. Oh, don't forget to stop recording.
Oh, yeah.